All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into some early chapters of the Quran, specifically chapters 1 and 2 chronologically, but you'll find them officially numbered 96 and 68.
Yeah, the Quran's organization is a bit of a puzzle. It's not arranged chronologically, but rather from the longest to shortest chapter.
Right, it's like they wanted to keep us on our toes.
Yeah.
But that just makes our exploration even more interesting. We got some fascinating excerpts to work with here, really focusing on the text itself and maybe some potential inconsistencies.
Yes, we'll be looking at these chapters from a skeptical, analytical perspective. And one thing that's always intrigued me is the idea of later insertions within the Quran.
Oh yeah, the idea that the text evolved over time. Okay, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the very beginning. Chapter 1, officially, chapter 96, is believed to be the first revelation. So I'm going to read it aloud to really set the scene.
Hearing it spoken can definitely bring out nuances that you might miss just reading it.
Okay, here we go. Recite in the name of your Lord, who created man from a clinging substance. Recite in your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. No, indeed man transgresses, because he sees himself self-sufficient. Indeed, to your Lord is the return. Have you seen the one who forbids a servant when he prays? Have you seen if he is upon guidance or enjoins righteousness? Have you seen if he denies and turns away? Does he not know that Allah sees? No. If he does not desist, we will surely drag him by the forelock, a lying, sinning forelock, and let him call his associates. We will call the angels of hell. No, do not obey him, but prostrate and draw near.
Wow, that repetition of recite, it's almost hypnotic. It really emphasizes the importance of oral transmission.
And especially when you consider that Muhammad was believed to be illiterate.
Hmm.
It raises all sorts of questions about how the Quran originated and was transmitted.
Right. Was it really a divine revelation from God or something more crafted and memorized and passed along?
Exactly. And it's interesting how just a few verses after emphasizing reciting, we get that reference to the pen. Why mention writing at all if this is the very first revelation? And the intended audience is largely illiterate.
Yeah, that always seems a bit out of place.
It does. And, another part that struck me as a little intense was the whole dragging by the forelock bit. Verses
Wow.
10 through 19 seem pretty aggressive, even threatening.
Right, but you have to remember the context. This is believed to be from the earliest days of Muhammad's revelations. He was likely facing a lot of resistance, doubt, maybe even hostility.
So you think these verses are kind of like a warning shot, like get on board or face the consequences?
It's possible to interpret it that way. They certainly establish a clear power dynamic. Allah is all-seeing, all-powerful, and those who disobey will face a grim fate.
Okay, so we've got this really dramatic opening act, call to recite a curious mention of the pen and a warning to those who resist. Where does chapter 2, officially chapter 68, take us from here?
Well, chapter 2 is where things get even more interesting, because it includes sections that are generally accepted as later additions, specifically verses 17 through 33 and 48 through 50.
Wait, hold on. So they just added stuff in later? That seems like a pretty big deal.
It is significant, and it raises even more questions about how the Quran was formed and evolved. If it was a divine revelation received all at once, why the need for these later additions?
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. Tell me more about these inserted verses. What do they add to this story?
Well, if you read the chapter without the insertions, it feels very personal. Like, it's directed at Muhammad himself. It focuses on his character, his mission, and a coming judgment.
And the insertions change that focus.
They do. For example, verses 17 through 33 tell this parable about these ungrateful garden owners. They hoard their wealth, they disobey Allah's commands, and they ultimately face destruction as punishment.
That feels like a pretty pointed message.
Yeah.
Especially if we're considering the context of a growing community with potential internal conflicts.
Right. It seems to be emphasizing obedience and warning against greed and disobedience.
Okay. And what about the second insertion, the story of the companion of the fish?
Yes. Verses 48 through 50. This story focuses on a man who loses a fish. And this fish is somehow linked to divine knowledge or power. He goes on this long, arduous journey, and ultimately he realizes the fish was a test from Allah. Again, the emphasis seems to be on submission to a higher power and accepting whatever trials come your way.
So both insertions, even though they tell different stories, seem to reinforce similar themes of obedience, punishment, and Allah's control. But why add these stories later? What was the motivation?
That's a great question. It makes you wonder if these additions were meant to address specific issues or doubts that were cropping up within the early Muslim community.
Like, hey, are people getting a little too comfortable or questioning the rules? Let's remind them about those disobedient gardeners and the guy who lost his fish.
It's an interesting possibility, isn't it? Maybe these insertions were a way to solidify authority, quell dissent, or reinforce specific doctrines as the community grew.
Yeah, it's like someone saw the original text and thought, needs a little more divine retribution.
It definitely adds a layer of intensity. And, it raises all sorts of questions about how the Quran was being shaped and reshaped, maybe to meet the needs of this growing community.
Right, okay. So we're seeing this theme of control and obedience popping up again and again. But there's another element in both these chapters that I found really interesting. This emphasis on the pen and writing.
Ah, yes, the pen verses. Always a point of contention.
It just seems so out of place in chapter 1. Supposedly the very first revelation when most people couldn't even read or write.
Right, if no one can read, why even mention the pen? Some argue it's symbolic, representing knowledge or divine revelation.
Yeah, but that feels a bit like a convenient explanation to smooth over a potential inconsistency.
It does, doesn't it?
Honestly, it makes you wonder if those verses were added later, when literacy became more widespread.
That's certainly a possibility. I mean, we're looking at these texts through centuries of interpretation and tradition. What we see as a single unified text today might have gone through all sorts of editing and redaction.
Okay, so we've got these references to the pen, and these later editions that seem to focus on obedience and punishment, if we're really putting on our skeptical hats here. What else can we learn from these chapters? What kind of pushback was Muhammad dealing with at this point?
Well, both chapters contain verses that seem to be directly addressing accusations against Muhammad. It's almost like the text is anticipating criticisms and trying to defend itself and its prophet.
Oh, interesting. Give me an example.
Like in chapter 2, verse 2, there's this line, "You are not by the favor of your Lord a madman." It suggests that some people were already accusing Muhammad of being insane.
Wow, so right from the start, people are questioning his sanity.
It definitely paints a picture of a society struggling with these new claims.
And the Quran seems to be acknowledging that skepticism and pushing back against it. Okay, so they're addressing the crazy accusations. What else?
Both chapters also emphasize Muhammad's good character. In chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "And indeed you are of a great moral character." It's like they're trying to establish his credibility.
Right, if you're going to convince people to follow you, you better have a good reputation. But what about the message itself? Did anyone question the content of the revelations?
Oh, absolutely. Chapter 2, verse 13 dismisses those who say, when our verses are recited to him, he says, "Legends of the former peoples."
So some people were basically accusing Muhammad of just recycling old myths and stories.
Right, and the Quran is pushing back, saying, no, this is the real deal. This is a genuine revelation.
It's fascinating to see these arguments and counter-arguments playing out in the text.
It really suggests that the Quran wasn't just dictated from above, but was being shaped through this dynamic interaction with the social and intellectual currents of the time.
It's all starting to feel very human, very grounded in this messy reality of introducing new ideas.
Exactly. It challenges that image of a purely divine, unchangeable text.
And it makes you wonder how this all plays into the Quran's relevance and authority today.
Right. If it was shaped by specific historical circumstances, can it really be considered a timeless universal guide? Does understanding this context make it more relatable, or does it raise doubts about its divine origins?
Those are some big questions.
They are, but wrestling with them, examining the text critically, can lead us to a deeper, more nuanced understanding.
Okay, so we've unpacked these two chapters. And I feel like we have more questions than answers now. It's like we're getting this glimpse into the very beginning of Islam, seeing the doubts, the challenges, and how the message itself evolved.
It is, and while we've only focused on these two chapters, they give us this window into how religious texts in general are formed, how they're interpreted, and how they ultimately shape beliefs and behavior.
Okay, and there's one more thing that stands out to me, especially when we're thinking about this from a skeptical perspective.
Yeah, what's the...
Well, it's the way these chapters present their claims. There's a lot of, all said this, and those who disbelieve will face that, but where's the actual evidence? Where are the arguments that would convince a skeptic?
That's a good point. These early chapters rely heavily on pronouncements and warnings, but they don't really offer much in the way of logical reasoning or empirical support. It's more about accepting the word of Allah as presented through Muhammad.
Right, it's like, believe this because I said so. But for someone coming from a skeptical perspective, that's just not enough.
Exactly. And It highlights a key difference between faith-based beliefs and those based on critical thinking.
So if we're approaching these chapters with our skeptical hats on, we're left with more questions than answers. We've got the pen versus these later editions that seem to focus on obedience, and a lack of real persuasive arguments.
Right, and it shows us just how complex the early development of a religious text can be, and the challenges it faces in being accepted. It also underscores the importance of critical analysis when we're looking at any text, especially those that claim divine authority.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, but I want to bring it back to our listener and the excerpts they shared. How does understanding the historical context and these potential inconsistencies shape their interpretation of the Quran?
That's a question for them to ponder. But it's crucial to remember that no text exists in a vacuum. The Quran, like any other ancient document, was shaped by the world around it, the social, the political, the intellectual currents of its time. Recognizing those influences can really lead to a more nuanced understanding.
It's like we've peeled back another layer of the onion.
Precisely. And by examining those layers, by questioning assumptions and exploring different interpretations, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the human element in how these texts were formed.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners,
hmm
especially those approaching the Quran from a skeptical point of view?
I think the most important thing is to stay curious, to ask those tough questions, and to never shy away from critical analysis. Don't be afraid to challenge traditional interpretations or explore different perspectives. After all, that's how we learn and grow and arrive at a more informed understanding of the world.
I love it. Keep those minds engaged and keep exploring. And until next time, happy digging.